Painting loose watercolor florals looks easy, effortless, but if you've ever tried it, you know that the exact opposite is almost always the case. Now, I'm here today to break it down a little bit more and make it not so difficult and mind-boggling. Today, I'm using Paul Rubens 100% cotton watercolor paper in a round shape, my Art for Joy's Sake watercolor palette in a limited color palette, and a few of my Art for Joy's Sake brush collection brushes, namely the 3/4 inch wash brush. It's a flat brush. You're going to be shocked at what you can do with this thing. I have 3 tips that I think are most important when you're approaching loose watercolor florals. Number 1, have an arsenal of brush strokes at your fingertips that you're comfortable with. Does this mean you have to have it all figured out in terms of all the brush strokes that you could possibly use? Absolutely not. I am going to link a few videos below that are really going to help you out with this one. Number 2, pay more attention to the angle of your brush before it hits the paper and makes a mark, then making the shape perfect on the paper after you've laid down the stroke. And number 3, and probably most important, be okay with redos. With loose watercolor florals, it's all about muscle memory, or mostly about muscle memory. So you might want to do the same flower. Maybe you're trying a peony 10 times, loosely, quickly, instinctively, before you start to feel that rhythm. Let's get into it. I'm starting with that flat wash brush and making sure that my palette is sprayed down and juicy. And number 2, well, that was number 1. And number 2, that my brush itself is actually damp so it can pick up the color easily. And just a stroke. This is a press, a little bit of a drag, and then a lift, and then a press. And notice here, I'm almost dabbing the brush and letting it drag out. So like a dab and a curve and a lift. And these strokes are very intentional in that they're instinctive, and I get in, I get out, and I'm done. So let's take another look at that in a little bit slower motion so I can describe it again. Let me know in comments, head down and tell me, do you find loose watercolor florals really difficult? And if you do, why? And maybe we can help each other. I'd love to know. You're going to be working around an invisible center. This is your main flower. So press, drag, and lift is the basic approach. I'm going to list that video below if you want to know more about this particular style of laying down strokes. And then a dab, a few more dabs on the right, go to the left, a bunch of dabs, and you're creating a side view petal. And look at how I stroked up and then right back down to create what looks like a single petal that has a curve to it, a little ruffle to it. This brush is incredible and can do so much for you. Great thing to try would be getting a scrap piece of watercolor paper and just see how many different types of marks you can make with this brush. And here, 2 strokes together downward and then filled in create a bigger leaf. A lot of the same type of movements, just an angled stroke, drag from different directions. Some are coming from the outside in, some are coming from the inside out. And look at how I use this brush on almost a perfect perpendicular to create some suggestions of branches or vines. Dab, 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 and then a big drag and another big drag, letting some of the strokes be thin and come to a point, and doing that with less pressure as I lift, and then letting some of the strokes actually be squared off, reflecting the simple nature of the brush itself, which is a flat wash brush. Look at this, a simple smiley face type stroke. It's a concave stroke, twice over on top of one another, and you have a larger minty green leaf. Look at all of these different strokes. Let's look at them again down here, this minty green cluster in a little bit of a slow-mo so you can really see what's going on. To start, I'm coming from the left and stroking up and towards that pink flower. Like I said, 2 concave or smiley face marks, one right on top of the other. My brush is at about a 45-degree angle to the page, and I'm using the whole width of that wash brush, the whole width. Just depending on the angle and how I'm holding it, I'm getting either a thinner mark or a thicker mark. That downstroke coming from in between those two yellowish olive green leaves, it's skinnier, and I still did a double stroke, but I kept them thin by using my brush almost at a 90-degree angle to the paper. Going in with my 1/2-inch dagger here with some pink and just doing some simple press and lift to create the idea of a bud, and then going back up to the main flower and just filling in over top to make that leftmost petal there on the side look a little bit fuller. If you do a hard press and lift, you're going to get a thicker kind of amoeba-like shape. And of course, if you do a quick tap or press and lift, you're going to get a really sketchy, simple, more pointed shape, like a misshapen teardrop. Loose watercolors are more about immediacy and less about lots and lots of layers. And so what happens in between those two ideas is that you don't have a lot of time for drying. And honestly, when I'm doing loose watercolors, I'm not letting the paper dry really. I'm just working around really wet areas to keep the freshness of the composition going. And as such, I'm going in with a really dark blue, which I made out of a blue and a brown, maybe a little bit of purple. And I'm dabbing in the center of that main flower, dab, 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 leaving the edges kind of scratchy, almost like I'm sketching with a pencil around the edges, but I'm making sure I don't touch into that pink, which is still damp on the page. And if I do touch with a few of these press and lift leaves on the right, I'm doing it with a soft touch so the bleeds that happen between that dark shadow color and the pink aren't crazy and messy. And that's another point about loose watercolor. You want to force some of that mingling, some of those bleeds. You want those to happen. So you want to see bleeds here and there between a petal and, say, a leaf. But you want to do them lightly together so that the explosions of color aren't so intrusive on one another. Because you don't want your pink flower turning into a green mess, right? I'm still using that 1/2-inch dagger and continuing to layer over top of those olive green leaves with some details, some veins in the leaves with a light touch. Now everything is still damp on the page, so I'm mindful of that as I dab into these pink buds. They're not wet, they're just damp. So knowing that I'm going to get a little bit of color bumping or explosions between two colors, but it's going to be controlled. Now, all of this might feel overwhelming. I don't know how long my paper is going to take to dry, so how do I know how much explosion I'm going to get? And Chrissy, I don't know where I should bump colors next to one another and where I shouldn't. The answers to all that confusion can just be figured out with practice and with trying and with putting brush to paper. So I encourage you to not try to grasp everything I'm saying in your mind right now. Just try this painting. And again, try it again, and again, try it again, quickly, instinctively, repetitively. And you will start to feel the loose watercolor florals mojo, I promise. Back up here on the top left of that main pink flower with some buds, press and lift, rinsing my brush, and adding a few thin marks with the very point of my dagger to create some greenery filler. And greenery filler is so important. You're going to want to check out the video I have linked below specifically to give yourself a really good base of filler brushstrokes to create. I'm going back to my flat wash brush with a watered down version of that dark color I used earlier. And I'm adding some really light, curved, repetitive strokes here on the left-hand side. The goal here is to fill out the composition, to kind of create also a sense of background with some very much watered down, simple strokes, even simpler strokes than I've been using so far. Let's take a look at that again. Slow it down a little bit. I'm creating these kind of simple, curved, leafy, suggestive type strokes. The paint is watered down, and I'm keeping it watered down. I keep adding water to my brush as I go because I don't really want texture over there. Maybe you do. I don't. And just filling in the left-hand side, following the curve of the original composition, but filling the left-hand side with those light, airy strokes. There isn't a ton of variation of size over here. There is a little bit, and that helps the composition, but not a ton. continuing on here on the right-hand side, it's so hard to talk about left, right, top, and bottom with a circle watercolor block, but you know, I'm working through it. And creating some press and lift branches at different angles and loosely following kind of the fan type spray of the leaf area just above where I'm making these branchy marks. Notice I'm kind of following how those leaves kind of span out or fan out from the main pink flower. And then with the brush and a little bit more pressure, I'm adding a few downward strokes to suggest leaves mingling in between those branchy moments. But primarily, I'm leaving those branches bare. Going back to my 1/2-inch dagger and just grabbing a little bit of pink, much watered down with a touch of green, whatever's on my mixing palette, and adding some simple, small press and lift strokes, all at different angles. Notice how I'm changing the angle of my brush as I go. And then without rinsing, picking up a little bit of that dark blue made from blue and brown. It's watered down and dabbing in a few little details and knowing full well that those details are going to be very, very much bumping into one another and creating simple, soft explosions. Loose watercolor florals doesn't mean lack of detail. So at this point, I'm going in with my 1/2-inch dagger and adding some suggestions of details, using a slightly watered down version of that dark color that I've been using to this point and adding a few suggestions of veins. Now, I'm going in dark, getting that brown, getting that blue, getting it as dark as I can, and I want to start to add some contrast. Not necessarily adding fine, intricate detail, but because I am upping the contrast with that leaf underneath the main pink flower, it is actually adding a sense of detail overall to the composition. And I really like that. I'm going to react to that by adding some more, but with smaller strokes near the top right cluster of leaves and petals and all the things happening up there. And a few little dots of that dark, dark color in the little buds here to the left of the main pink flower. So adding detail doesn't mean the strokes have to be small. It can also mean adding contrast so that things start to pop more and make the eye think that there's more detail going on. Using the darkness that was on that brush from the work I was just doing, but adding some water and then some simple press and lift strokes to fill in that background just a bit more. White space in loose watercolors I find to be pretty important. So I'm very mindful of what's left behind, what's left untouched in a composition that is decidedly very loose, very sketchy, very breezy. And you can see that here where I'm really leaving the right-hand side, that little runway, that little curved runway, empty on purpose. It gives everything a visual rest. Make sure that even though I'm adding some of these dark detail moments, they don't become obtrusive and everything still feels light and airy. A few tendrils with that dark, dark color using my liner brush. And we're about done here. Now, it's easy to get stuck here and lost in the loveliness of adding all those linear details because we all know how satisfying they are. But just remember to get out before you go too nuts with those gorgeous linear details. A little bit, a little touch is all you need. And if you're curious about using the liner brush, I have some drills. I'm gonna link the video below. All right. Who recognizes this painting? Let me know in comments. If you know, you know. And while you're at it, go ahead and give this video a boop, but only if you're finding value. And I certainly hope you are. Okay, I have to know, I've been playing around with this repeat footage in slow motion so I can wax poetic more about painting. Is it helpful? Head into comments and let me know if you like it when I repeat footage and slow things down and talk about the technique more. Or do you just find it just boring? Now you're ready to dive into your next loose watercolor floral, and guess what? That wash brush is gonna be your friend in this next one. Go get that sunflower, friends, and until next time, happy painting.